Hello, I am David Marks, the Director of Financial Compliance. Today, in the HB3 and 30 series, we are reviewing the changes to state compensatory education. This is the third video in the series. We will cover the following. What is compensatory education? How did HB3 change Comp Ed? Identification of student information, census tiers, flow of SCE allotment funding, use of SCE funds, and the advisory committee. What is compensatory education? The goal of the SCE program is to provide additional resources to reduce any disparity in performance between educationally disadvantaged students, at-risk students, and all other students. How did HB3 change compensatory education? Increases overall allotment. Instead of a fixed weight of 0.2, it is now a spectrum 0.225 through 0.275. Established a new allotment methodology based on the census block in which the student resides. Changes spending requirements. Now it's 55% of the allotment must be spent on the SCE program. Requires a compensatory education advisory committee. I'll get into more details on these changes over the course of the presentation. The changes in the weight to a spectrum will result in a significant increase in funding for these students. Previously, these students earned approximately an extra $1,000, and now the spectrum will provide approximately an additional $1,400 on the low end and $1,700 on the high end. This is a 35% and a 65% increase for these students. The framework for the new Comp Ed spectrum is based on a tiering methodology that will be reviewed annually. TEA is developing a tool that will allow school districts and charter schools to easily obtain census block group based on the student's address. TEA will not receive the actual student address information, only the census block group. And it allows the use of an alternative calculation when no census data is available. A key point to remember is that prior to HB3, TEA used the average of the best 6 months of students eligible for free and reduced lunch program that we obtained from Texas Department of Agriculture. Now SCE funding will be based on the coding of individual students. Now let's discuss a frequently asked question that we have received. What is the difference between an economically disadvantaged student and an educationally disadvantaged student? Texas Education Code defines educationally disadvantaged as eligible to participate in the National Free or Reduced Price Lunch Program, which is the same for economically disadvantaged. The terms have an identical meaning. Identification of student information. Step 1. Students are determined to be educationally disadvantaged. Step 2. Identify the student's resident address. Step 3. Identify the census block group of that address. TEA will provide a free tool for this purpose. Step 4. The census block group assigned to the student determines the tier and the weight the student earns for SCE allotment. Key point. The district will base the resident address on where the student resides on the PEIMS fall snapshot date. We have a few more frequently asked questions. Do I now get compensatory education funding for all students based on their home address tier? No. Students must first meet the eligibility requirements for compensatory education. What if I can't identify a student's census block group from the tool that will be created by TEA for use this fall? Sometimes, especially for new addresses, lookup tools will not produce results. Feel free to consult census block group maps to make the identification manually. Key point. In the event a census block group is not assigned, the eligible student will be assumed into the lowest funded tier, receiving the 0.225 weight. What address should I use for determining the census block group for a student with P.O. Box? Since a P.O. Box is not a resident address, the district needs to obtain the physical address of where the student resides. What address should I use for determining the census block group for a student who is homeless? Districts do not need to report a census block group for a student who is homeless. TEA will use the address of the campus on which the student is enrolled to determine the census block group for that student. What address should I use for determining the census block group for a student when parents have joint custody of the child? Use the parent's address that qualifies the student for attendance at that campus. What address should I use for determining the census block group for a student residing in a residential facility? There are some funding and data collection issues with regard to residential facility students that require additional review by TEA. So expect more guidance on this issue to be posted to the HB3 Frequently Asked Question document in the coming weeks. Census tiers. Below are the 5 categories used in determining census block groups: median household income, highest average educational level of the population, percentage of single-parent households, home ownership rate. Just a reminder, we'll be establishing an advisory committee and they may choose to include other economic information. How the categories of census block groups were used to determine tier placement. After scoring all 15,286 block groups, they were ranked from lowest to highest. Census block groups were placed into tiers starting with the lowest scores going into Tier 5, which earns the highest funding weight. This methodology is fully described in a report posted on the HB3 website. Again, the four indicators for tiering are median household income, percent home ownership, percent single parent households, educational score percent. Let's look at Tier 3 as an example. Tier 3 shows that for each category it is ranked in the middle. Therefore, it was assigned a total socioeconomic score of 2, which places it in the middle. The links at the bottom of this slide provide for additional details for census block groups for a campus and county. The next group of slides provide a graphical look at the census block groups. This is the statewide look at the census block groups. Remember, the level of funding for each student is based on the tier of the student's home address. The color is the initial tier that was assigned to begin the flow of funds. Remember, the green color is receiving the highest weight, followed by blue, yellow, orange, and red is the lowest weight. Remember, as stated earlier, all these tiers will bring in significantly more funds for these students. Census tier close-up view, Harris County. Each red dot is a campus. Census tier close-up view for Dallas County. Census tier close-up view, Bexar County. Census tier close-up view, Hidalgo County. And census tier close-up view for Gray County. For an interactive map of the entire state with census data, visit the link on this slide. Let's look at another question. What if a block group doesn't have a tier assigned due to insufficient census information? In all non-standard cases, educationally disadvantaged students will be assigned into the lowest funded tier, receiving the .225 weight. SCE allotment funding for 2019-20. Initially, Comp Ed funds will use the campus address as the census block group to begin the flow of funds. In the second half of the year, FSP funds will be adjusted based on the information districts submitted in their fall PEIMS submission. Key point. In some cases, actuals may be noticeably different from the methodology used to produce estimates. Districts should budget accordingly. TEA will initially fund the SCE allotment for 2019-2020 based on the census block group of each campus and the fall 2018 student estimates. An Excel document containing estimated SCE allotments by district can be found on the HB3 website. This funding methodology produces an estimate, but this is not the actual payment methodology stipulated by law. This methodology is used because student enrollment information by census block group is not yet known. As a result, a reconciliation process will be required after that information is obtained. To adjust for actuals for 2019-2020, the fall PEIMS submissions will be used as the determination for each student's educationally disadvantaged status and census block group. Districts must first continue to determine if the student is educationally disadvantaged before determining their census block group. Remember, not all students will need to have a census block group, only those qualifying for Comp Ed. Key point, because the funding will be based on information collected by the school district or charter school, the identified and reported information must be accurate so the district or charter school receives the correct amount of funding. Beyond 2019-2020, LPE funding estimates will be based on census block groups reported as of the prior year's fall snapshot date for educationally disadvantaged students. Expect more correspondence on this topic in future years. For SCE funding, where a district participates in a community eligibility provision, rules may be amended for the method of determining the number of students who qualify for an SCE allotment at a campus. It appears the legislative intent was to be based on the individual student's information, and the proposed rule will reflect the legislative intent. How do we handle community eligibility provision students for compensatory education funding? Prior to HB3, school districts and charter schools participating in a CEP were required to follow 19 TAC for an alternative reporting method. This will not change. Districts are required to collect information to determine if a student is educationally disadvantaged for determining funding for compensatory education. Use of SCE funds. State compensatory education funding can be spent on the following: programs that meet the needs of educationally disadvantaged students, child care expenses for students at risk of dropping out of school, Pay the costs associated with services provided through a life skills program. Support a program eligible under Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Can funds be spent on students at risk of dropping out as defined in TEC 29.081D? Yes. Students that meet one of the 13 criteria are eligible for the same supplemental services they received before the passage of HB 3. Additionally, the students who were designated as educationally disadvantaged can receive supplemental services paid for with compensatory education funds. State compensatory education spending requires that at least 55% of the SCE funds allocated must be used to fund supplemental programs and services for these students. This is an increase from prior requirements of 52%. Another question. Will TEA continue to allocate expenditures coded to PIC 99? Yes, TEA will continue to allocate PIC 99 to the other programs through PEIMS after the mid-year submission. However, TEA recommends that districts and charters code as much as they can to the actual program and campus. Can I continue to use state compensatory education allotment funds to pay for the second half of a pre-K program? Yes, you may continue to use state compensatory education funds to pay for the second half of a pre-K program as long as the students meet the eligibility for use of the allotment. Additionally, HB 3 added the early education allotment, which is another significant funding stream for districts and charters to use to fund the second half of a pre-K education program. The district or charter is required to offer a full-day pre-K program for 4-year-olds and may use other funding sources as long as the student meets the allowability for use guidelines. The Commissioner will adopt rules regarding the use of funds in October 2019. The State Board of Education will adopt rules that require a report as part of the annual financial report and determine minimum standards for the report. The Commissioner of Education will review the reports submitted in the annual financial report, determine compliance with the rules on allowable use of funds. If it is determined the district or charter is not in compliance, the Commissioner shall withhold funds until compliance is achieved, and this begins with the 2021-2022 fiscal year. What if my district does not meet the spending requirements for this year because of the changes that were made to state funding? The district or charter will be required to make up the difference in the following year. For an example, district received $100, required to spend $55 on the program, only spent $45. The following year, the district will be required to spend $10 plus 55% of the new allotted amount for the new year. Takeaway: the district or charter needs to meet the needs of its students regardless of the difficulties in budgeting. Compensatory Education Advisory Committee. An advisory committee will be formed in fall of 2019 to advise the agency in adopting rules for the SCE allotment. The advisory committee will consist of members appointed by the Commissioner. The advisory committee will help the TEA in amending and adopting rules establishing other economic criteria to be considered for the census block group, and at least every 2 years review census and student data and make recommendations. Additional information coming soon. TEA next steps. Develop a tool that allows districts and charters to upload student addresses to obtain census block group information. Creation of an advisory committee in the fall of 2019 and propose rules in October 2019. District next steps. Report to TEA the census block group for educationally disadvantaged students for fall 2019. Stay tuned for the most up-to-date information from TEA on the implementation of House Bill 3. Visit tea.texas.gov/HB3 for the most up-to-date information. Email hb3info@tea.texas.gov with any questions. Thank you and have a great day.